So my name's Steve Wright. I work for John Lewis Partnership. I've been there about 18 months. And I'm assuming, because you're here to understand about GDPR. But just to get a sort of a feel for it, how many of, so you're all, I assume you're all CISOs, or in security, or in IT. But how many of you specifically have responsibility for data protection? Because that's, okay, so you guys need to pay attention, right? Because this is what this is all about. So I'm just going to go through a very, very brief presentation. But I have 3 kids, and they kept on asking me, Daddy, what do you do? So when I was in security, it was quite easy to explain. Well, I keep bad guys out, you know, and I keep organisations safe. That's easy. And they could kind of get that because they'd been taught it at school. But then 7, 8 years ago, when I started moving into privacy, it was a little bit more harder to explain. And then, of course, GDPR started to emerge. And I then had to somehow illustrate to my kids what GDPR is. This is that illustration. And it's not only worked on my kids. Strangely enough, it's worked on my board. And in fact, I've just come from the board meeting. But I gave this presentation a long time ago. And so we've come a long way in John Lewis in terms of their understanding of what GDPR is. But whenever I go and speak to someone, I start right back at the beginning with this story. So there's a little bit of a story, and then I'm going to dive into some of the actual components of GDPR. Now, I'm assuming you all know what GDPR is, right? Because there's enough propaganda and enough software that's going to give you a silver bullet to resolve this problem, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm about to unravel some of that. Okay, so I assume this was, now picture this. This is Farmer Giles, nice chap, and he wants to buy a cow, right? Strange. He wants to buy a cow. Now, when he buys a cow, you can't just buy a cow, stick it in a field, and not worry about it, right? You've got to think about fencing the cow in, putting a gate in the process, making sure that you understand who's going in and accessing the cow. You've also got to think about what you feed the cow, and importantly, you've got to think about, that doesn't work, okay. Importantly, you've got to think about milking the cow for value, right? And of course, you're going to go on holiday. So, and there's going to be winters, and there's going to be times when you need to store the cow. So you've got to think about where you're storing the cow. And this is the story of GDPR, essentially. What GDPR is doing, in essence, is fundamentally changing the way that we think about data. It's making us more responsible, a bit like this farmer, Giles, here. It's making us think, hang on a minute, there's more to just having a cow than collecting a cow from the market and then just sort of milking it. You've got to think about vaccinations. You've got to make sure it doesn't get infected, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to make sure that foot and mouth, as people come and visit it, they don't bring in infections or take stuff away. And that's really, you know, fundamentally, accountability is what GDPR is all about. Just like having a cow, there are responsibilities with owning a cow or looking after animals. So what I've done is, I hope there's no vegetarians in the room. I'm going to now slice the cow into 14 components that, strangely enough, map directly to the 14 components of GDPR. You've never seen this done, I know. It's a miracle. Ta-da! And this is what we're going to spend the next 20 minutes talking about, all right? Now, because I'm the kind of guy that sort of gets shouted at and I'm used to it, please feel free to ask questions as we go along, okay? And I'll do my best to answer them. What I can tell you is a couple of things. I'm not a lawyer, okay? I am just a security and privacy professional that's been doing this a while. That's all. That's all I am, okay? So even I, on any of these matters, I get to a certain point in my interpretation, and then I get my external legal counsel to validate it. So even if you're looking at GDPR for your organisation, so, okay, let me ask you another question, right? Put your hands up if you have employee data or marketing customer data in your organisation. Fantastic, full house. Okay, you are all eligible for GDPR. Because unless you're out in Argentina or somewhere like that and you're just here for the day, you are, unless of course you import and export into the EU, you are eligible for these new rules. So the reason I broke it into these 14 components is because my mum told me, how do you eat an elephant? And I thought, oh, a spoonful at a time, she said. But I never liked that one. I just wouldn't want to eat an elephant. But a cow, I quite like. So that's why I chose a cow, not an elephant. And also it helps with my farmer analogy. So you've got, oh, these don't work. OK. I've purposely put the two gristly, chunky bits of rights and accountabilities on the leg, right? They're really hard. This is what we're grappling with. This is essentially what the board meeting was in this morning, and I've got to go back at 2 o'clock. We're dealing with fundamental rights that you and I as consumers and employees will have on May the 25th next year. So if you like, the way I say it is, imagine data protection on steroids. All of a sudden, I have the power to go to any organisation, including my own, and request that they fulfil certain rights within a month. And if they don't, then I have legitimate reasons to go to the ICO and make a complaint. And then what you don't want, what we all don't want, is the ICO coming in going, well, what are you doing with your data down there? How come you don't understand it? So those rights, there's about 6 of them. They're things like, you may have heard, the right to be forgotten. That's the common one that most people have heard about, the right to be forgotten. So I phone up the contact centre and say, do you know what, I'm getting really bored of you sending me information, so please can you forget me? Okay, well then you scratch your head. Well, are you sure? Because you're on our loyalty scheme, and I can see that you're a big spender, and once a month you receive our vouchers in exchange for us profiling and understanding more and more about you. Are you sure you want to do that? Yeah, I want to be forgotten. Okay, all right. Well, first of all, let me just validate you are who you say you are. You're not some estranged husband or wife, so I've got to do some validation exercise. And then I've got to make sure wherever Steve _ Steve dot, Steve X, Wright, etc., every variation and all the data attributed to Steve Wright is then deleted throughout my organisation within 30 days. That's one right. Now, we've got 90,000 staff. I don't know how you've got. That's 90,000 people, potentially, who could go, well, no, they wouldn't ask the right to be forgotten because they want to be paid. But, you know, there's new rights that our staff will have on the 25th of May. So we've got to make sure our HR services are fully ready for that. But our biggest challenge is our customers, because like you, we have millions of customers, very loyal customers, repeat business customers. And so we've got to make sure that we can enable those rights on the 25th of May. So you can imagine there's a whole teams of people been spun up. The Big Four are enjoying themselves at our place at the moment, because naturally we've got to create the whole entire end-to-end process for each of those rights, from start to finish. And we've got to log it. We've got to make sure, even on a right to be forgotten request or right to erasure, I've still got to keep a record of that, because then if they complain in 6 months' time and say, I'm still receiving marketing. Yes, but we deleted it, and you requested it. Look, it's here. So actually, the right to be forgotten, we can't entirely forget. We've still got to be able to do it. So that's the rights. And that's why I put it at the back of the leg, because it's chewy, it's not very tasty, and basically it's the most unpalatable part of GDPR that you're going to face. The other bit is accountabilities. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been in security now 20 odd years, and even simple things like access control still cause a problem. Privileged access users, etc. You've got the whole JML process, constant people coming, constant people leaving, etc., etc. So I don't know about you, but accountabilities is really hard. So what you've got to do, unfortunately, is you've got to go all the way from the top. So I've got 3 board directors who have responsibility for customer data, HR data, and supplier data. And I've said to them in no uncertain terms, you're going to jail, not me. I'm just here to tell you what's what. That's my job as independent advisor, as independent data protection officer, and as I'm the CISO as well. I'm just here to tell you that's what you've got to do. They're like, oh, Steve, that's pretty mental. Okay, what do I need to do? So we've just spent the last year defining what it is they need to do. What is the minimum position that they need to have in place by May 2018, right? And it's a lot of work, as you can imagine. So that's the accountabilities, knowing who does what, where and when, all the way from the top, all the way down. So if the ICO come in on the 26th of May, they've got to be able to go, oh yes, this person is responsible for this data set. Here's all the processing activities that take part, let's say customer, ... These systems, these applications, here's where the data is, here is where the data is stored, here's the rights for any of those customers all the way through. So I hope you're starting to see the size of this challenge, right? So for those 4 or 5 of you that put your hand up, you know, welcome to my hell. Then you've got assurance and governance. So you wouldn't expect any program, any kind of piece of law that doesn't ensure that there's some sort of accountability and assurance mechanism to repeat and to validate and to make sure that you are doing what you said you would do in your policies. And that's essentially what the whole governance and assurance piece is. Now, there are a load of articles about each of these, right? They don't break it up like the cow, like I have done for you. Unfortunately, there's about 100 articles and about 100 recitals. And on top of that, just to make it extra little bit more spicy, there's an institution called the Article 29 Working Party, which is essentially like the data protection of all 28, yes, we're still a member, all 28 member states. And they all get together and they keep producing guidance. And the guidance doesn't always fit in with the recitals and the articles. So you're left going, oh, well, I don't know where they've got that from. So there's a massive amount of interpretation that's happening in my team. And my data privacy team is 7 now, and I've got 1 lawyer and 5 qualified lawyers, not actual, sorry, legal degrees, yeah? That's on there. And then I've got my InfoSec teams in John Lewis and Waitrose. So policies and standards. So we all know, we all go to SANS or we go to the ISF and we pull down and we cut, paste, blah, blah, blah. But be careful what you write, because naturally, if you say your encryption is 128, blah, 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 whatever you state in your policy, if it's not enforced on the 25th of May, then they can fine you. And I just assume you all know the 2 to 4% of fines of your turnover, yeah? You all know that, right? So I've been revising for at least a year now all of our InfoSec policies. And they're like, well, Steve, these were only published 2 years ago. I said, yeah, but if the ICO come in, we can't do that. It's great to have aspirational policies, but it's not worth it. It's not worth the paper it's written on. What do we actually do? What do we want to do? How are we, materially reducing the risk to our organisation? So the whole policies and standards have been revised. Security. How am I doing? Security, which is the remit of most of your responsibilities. I'm sure not, maybe more than that. Security, so we talked about access controls, but even the basic stuff like patch management, vulnerability management, pen testing, knowing where your critical vulnerabilities are and then being able to patch them in adequate time. The other sort of similar areas like segregation. So you may choose to, as a way of reducing your risk, you may choose to segregate your network as one of your controls, right? All of these parts or components that make up security that we would come to expect as just basic best practice is essentially now enshrined in this law. So it doesn't specify what they are. It doesn't say, please ensure your ISO 27001. If anything, that would have been easier. But actually what they do is please ensure that it's technically, organisationally, process-enabled safeguards that are appropriate to the risk, right? Which is sort of quite difficult to interpret. But then, if you look at the ICO's last 5 years' worth of fines, you will find it's access control, poor password management, retention. It's all the good stuff that you'd expect to see, you know, learning and training and all of that kind of thing. That's what the ICO have found wanting in those organisations that have had a breach. They've gone in, investigated. So I asked Matt Hancock, the MP, who's responsible for the data protection bill coming in, which is our version of GDPR, and he said to me, this is security by the back door. This is making security legal requirement. So that's it, guys. We've now got a legal requirement. So I keep saying to my teams, don't think of this as just privacy. This is wholeheartedly security and privacy together, mitigating those risks and making sure that we can prove to the ICO we did as much as possible, everything within our power, if we have a breach. Or as I like to say to my board, when we have a breach, which gets them really wild. Risk management, so as you can appreciate, the premise of this is risk management. You know, the ICO Commissioner, Elizabeth Denham, I've met her a few times. Every time she always talks about proportionate and risk-based. So that means you've got to have a system of risk assessment, you know, identification, assessment, mitigation. So the whole thing is what we're all doing anyway, whether you're a CIO or a CISO or a DPO. It's all about the risk assessment processes, making sure they're robust, making sure you've understood the different levels of risk for, you know, operational and enterprise, etc. Deletion and retention. So I think it's about 1/3 of the ICO fines have been related to data that was held for longer than the purpose is. So this is a big challenge for organisations such as ours because of legacy. Now we've been around a bit, so we've collected quite a bit of data over the time. The problem is with marketing departments and IT departments, they just hang on to it forever and a day because basically, you know, memories become inexpensive, so it doesn't matter. We just build more capability, more capacity. But the problem is the ICO say if your policy states it's 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, depending on whether it's a warranty and you have to hang on to it for a fridge or a TV, etc. That's legitimate interest, it's a different reason. If you put 5 years, then you make darn sure it's 5 years and that you've deleted your data after 5 years. If it's 2 years, it's 2 years. So a big challenge. And also they expect, because I went up to see the ICO last month, and they expect that to be applied to your backups and your archives as well. Quality assurance is about simply making sure that all of this is done in an effective way. That's all that means. Nearly there. Third parties, legal. So let's get to the real tricky stuff now, the back end. So third parties and legal. So under the new rules, you have to have valid consent. That's one thing, right? So as a minimum, go back to your organisations and check you have valid consent to send marketing information to your customers. If you don't, phone a lawyer, get them in and get them to check if it's going to withstand the test come May 25th, right? However, there's a big part in this about transparency. So the whole privacy notices and the whole third parties, you now have to disclose to your customers and to your organisation where the data is, who's got access to it, why you have it in the first place, etc., etc. So basically, it's full disclosure right up front. Now, you're not going to, let's be honest, right? Most of us, we scroll down, we tick, yeah, whatever, because we want the app, or we want the service, or we want this, right? We don't really read it. Now, on your privacy policy, you're going to have to enable a click-through where it completely is transparent about what you're doing with the data, where it is, who's hosting it for you, what third parties have access to it, all of this kind of stuff. That has to be disclosed as of the 25th of May next year. Awareness and training. Obviously, you would expect there to be quite a... We've got a new e-learning program that we're rolling out at the end of this month. That's to all 90,000 staff. And then we've got different training for branches, different training for our call centres, and different training for our top executives, yeah? A few hundred of them. So that's the campaign that's running up till May next year, and we would have covered all of those by then. And then I think I've done nearly there. Monitoring and reporting. So this is sort of under breach management as well, really. Under breach management, you have to disclose or notify to both the customer and the ICO within 72 hours. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've ever lived through a breach, I've had many now, not at John Lewis, of course, but if you've ever lived in a breach situation, 72 hours is not long at all to do the forensic investigation, to understand even the root cause of why this all happened in the first place. And also, what you've got to do in 72 hours is you've got to do a privacy impact assessment. You've got to look at what was the impact to the individual. Now, that's very different from your typical CIA type impact assessment for your BIAs. Sorry to use these acronyms, but it's different from that because it's about impact to the individual. How did the individual feel affected by that breach? What do you mean affected? Well, Your Honour, my client was deeply mortified to have their data exposed all over LinkedIn or wherever it is, Pastebin, and was depressed for at least 2 months following this. And he's seeking claims compensation of $52,000 for loss of earnings and for the heavy depression. Well, what evidence do you have? Here he is, sir. I'm so badly treated by this organisation. That's all they've got to do now. The onus is on us as organisations to prove we did everything in our power to stop that individual being impacted. So that's massive implications, which is why you think PPI scams, mis-selling was big business. You ain't seen nothing yet. We are going to get class action coming out of our ears. We're going to have ambulance chases chasing people, individuals down the road going, did you feel affected by your breach? Was you upset? Would you like some money back? Yes, please. So we're getting ready for that litigation nightmare, tsunami, as I call it. And then finally, I put it at the rear end of the cow because it's very thinly described in terms of what is demonstrating compliance in the articles. But it's fair to say that it's a bit of everything. It's a bit of knowing that those rights can be done. It's a part of knowing that you've got the ownership all the way from the board all the way down. You know, it's making sure the policies aren't just shelfware. You know, it's making sure that you can walk up to an individual and say, oh, were you trained on phishing scams? Oh, yes. How does you think that impacts someone from their rights? Oh, I haven't thought about that. Okay. So it's about knowing and understanding fully how GDPR has been applied across your business, and that effectively is demonstrating compliance. Now, what you will be told, I'm afraid, and forgive me because I haven't been fully out there, I don't know if there's any silver bullets being offered or touted, so forgive me for, I'm not slating any vendors, but in my experience, you will find certain companies doing bits, but not the whole cow. That's my experience. So if someone's offering you a solution for your cow, then they're possibly not telling the truth, okay? Little porkies. Oh, I nearly forgot the most important one. Oh, my word. How could I forget that? Right on the other. So privacy impact, or privacy by design, and security by design has to be in your change control process or in your decision-making forums. Yes, whatever your forums are, where you make changes or make decisions about changes that could impact an individual, both HR and customer, then you've got to register that. You've got to record it. You've got to make sure you've got the decisions about what was made, what risk rating it received. And there are some solutions specifically for that out there at the moment. So that's pretty much it, ladies and gents. I don't think yeah, there you go. Very happy farmer. He's now got it all resolved. There's rain on the way, sweeping in from the west, called GDPR on the 25th of May. So good luck and make sure you've got a fantastic barn. That's it.